Welcome. It's really good to see you. And this evening we are continuing to think about our imagination. So the theme running all the way through our summer Wednesdays has been the imagination, and we've been thinking particularly about how we curate or develop or sharpen our imagination. Thinking particularly about writing and painting, and this week thinking especially about literature and grace. Personally, I'm really excited about this evening. I'm really looking forward to it. Not just because I'm an English literature graduate, although that is quite a significant factor, I'm sure. But I'm really pleased that David is leading us this evening. For those of you who don't know, David both writes and teaches. That's all right, Carol, all right? Sure. You might not have last year or the year before, we had one of your poems on the front of our Easter order of service.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
last year and the year before. Yeah, okay. But you write all sorts of things, not just poetry.
Yeah, so creative essays, non-fiction, and I'd like to write more fiction, but kind of that's not something I've had the space to do yet. So kind of that's something I'd like to do more. But kind of essays, criticism, and a bit of poetry.
Great. Well, thank you so much for this evening. I'll hand straight over to you, and the person on the other end of Carol's phone. Did you?
Not properly. I know. How about that? Hold that down. Not very technological.
I think it's the bottom one you have to hold down.
Which turn the volume?
Power off. There you go. That's it.
Well, I mean, welcome. Let me add my welcome to Nat. And I really just want to use this session to think about some of the ways in which writing, I'm talking about literature particularly, so poetry and fiction. And we might kind of think about other forms of literature in the discussion, but the examples I'm going to focus on today are poetry and fiction. How those forms might depict the Christian gospel. So how they might depict our relationship with God through Christ in different ways. And really, it's kind of going to be quite interactive today. So I'm hoping not to speak for ages, and rather to sort of kick off a discussion about some of these texts. So I've got a few texts that we're going to look at and really sort of talk about and hope to open up together to think about kind of what does it look like to convey God's grace to us in a literary text. So I'm thinking about this idea of literature and grace. What might it look like for a poem, a short story, or a novel to depict grace? So if we say that grace is a kind of unearned gift from God to us, what might that look like in a literary form? And there are a couple of reasons why I'm interested in that. Obviously, I'm interested in that idea because it's a core theme of the gospel or theme of Christian theology. But I'm also interested in it from the point of view of what a literary text might do with that. So how would a literary text, a poem, short story, a novel, how might a literary text explore the relationships between us as human beings and God and God's grace to us? What might that look like? And as we sort of open up some of these texts, we'll hope to maybe start to answer that question, I hope. But as I say, I'm not going to do too much talking. It's going to be more seminar style, but hopefully fairly loose. And I guess most of my examples are going to be sort of more modern, so kind of 20th century. But I'm going to start with the 17th century poem, and I'm going to move into more sort of 20th century stuff. But I wonder whether the first question we might have in our head is what do we think that kind of might be the challenges, some of the challenges or some of the problems of writing about God? What might be some of the challenges or problems in the idea, in the process of writing about God and writing about our relationship to God as human beings? Just open that up as a sort of free question. So,
what in existence, it has no words.
yes, exactly. Yeah.
It, in a way, it's kind of putting into words something that actually has no words.
Exactly. So I think, and there are other, there's lots of sort of more things we could say, but exactly, it's a sense of kind of how do we talk about something so big? How do we talk about something so ineffable? And I'm sure there are similar issues involved with other art forms. But you know, when we're thinking about words have limitations. Words can't describe everything. So there's a sense in which, how do we describe something that's kind of beyond our understanding, or even beyond our even our own experience can only partially capture. So kind of that's sort of one of the key things I wanted to do. And actually, what's interesting is a lot of these writers are actually performing that very idea. So the poet George Herbert, I'm not going to give you a Herbert poem, but just to start off with, writing in the 17th century, said this: speech alone, he said, and I think by implication that's writing as well, doth vanish like a flame. So speech alone doth vanish like a flaring thing. And I think the image there of that flaring thing, that's the idea of like a flame kind of briefly, you can see it and then it goes out. So verse or poetry for somebody like Herbert has got to be humble, has got to kind of has got to grapple with the fact that it's kind of it's finite and limited, and that what he's trying to talk about is something infinite and big. There's another, I'm not sure where this is, but he says at one point, verse cannot vault or dance or play. So that's in the sense that the poems that he's trying to do have got to kind of be humble and know their place in this hierarchy where God and God's grace through Christ is kind of the most important working. So I want to start with one of Herbert's contemporaries, who was a poet called John Donne. And I want to kind of just start with this poem as a kind of, partly because I wanted to start a bit further back in history before we start looking at 20th century stuff, but also because I think it's quite an unusual way of articulating our human relation to God. Does anybody know this poem? You've never seen it before. Matt? Yeah, so kind of, if you're an English graduate, you may have come across this poem. So Donne's interesting for lots of reasons. He became an ordained Church of England clergyman fairly late in life, and there's a kind of, I think, a debate as to why he became a clergyman and whether he really wanted to be a clergyman. But what's interesting is these kind of holy sonnets kind of actually published on his death, so they kind of emerge. They're sort of published posthumously. The other interesting thing about Donne is that he's quite well known in his early poetry for writing erotic poems. So it's kind of interesting that you've got these very two sort of different registers that he's well known for. And in some sense, one of the things that kind of becomes puzzling about Donne is how you fit those two things together. Are they sort of, is this the same guy? Is he sort of just writing a different kind of persona? But let's have a look at this. Can you all see it? Okay, can you read it? Okay, let's have a look at this poem. What do you make of it? And just thinking about particularly the language. What do you think is like striking about it? Sorry,
Can I ask a favour? With poetry, unless somebody reads it aloud,
okay.
I find it like, yeah. So can I request that?
Yeah, very good.
Not that
I meant to read it, and I meant to
but
read
it would be lovely to figure out.
I'd forgotten I was going to do that. So let me do that for you. So Holy Sonnet 14. Batter my heart, three-personed God, for you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand, o'erthrow me, and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. I, like an usurped town to another you, labour to admit you, but oh, to no end. Reason, your voice viceroy in me, should defend, but is captive, and proves weak or untrue. Yet dearly I love you, and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie or break that knot again, take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. So maybe just take a moment to let that sink in. But yeah, any sort of immediate kind of responses to the language that Donne's using here, the kind of words that he's using, what might be unusual about it or striking in any way.
It's quite a sexual language, actually.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
talking about like particularly the last two lines.
yeah,
Being informed, chased, or ravaged.
yeah.
That he's betrothed to the enemy. Is that like saying that he's going to marry his enemy?
He's already married to the devil.
Yeah, I mean, is that that? Yeah, and I wonder. Yeah, could be or could be his way of describing sin. I don't know whether yeah, either or both could be that. And I think you're right. So the language is weirdly sexual or erotic at times. It seems that way, and also romantic. But also, I wondered whether
Quite violent.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, not just potentially romantic or sexual, but also violent. That's my heart. Person God.
That makes me think of Song of Solomon,
Mm.
because that's a sort of dynamic going on there.
Mm.
A bit.
I mean, what do we make of that? I mean, what do we make of it? I guess it's hard to ask you that when you've just received it, but I wonder if there's any sort of immediate reactions to that way of talking about our relationship with God in this poem.
I've got quite a few poems in my book, and God is in a lot of them. And it's very down to earth, Cockney speaking, rhyme. But so is that, because defend, bend, mend. So mine, that's how I write my poems.
It's a really good point. And actually, this is a very plain language. I mean, I've done a lot of his earlier poems, use very intricate sort of metaphors and conceits. This one doesn't particularly. It's actually quite straightforward in the sense that it's using this image of of a love relationship, of a marriage, it seems, or a romantic relationship, and he's using it to talk about the kind of relationship he has, the speaker, we should say. It's not necessarily done himself, but the speaker here has with God. I wonder about we sort of talked about the violence. The first couple of lines: "Batter my heart, three-person to God. For you as yet, but not breathe, shine, seek to mend." Actually, I'm not sure whether I know what the second line is. I mean, but just in the first line, "Batter my heart, three-person God." Why do you think he makes it through the three-person God here? Because he could just say God, and he could address it to Christ. But yes, that's interesting, isn't it? So it's like it's Trinitarian. And I wonder if this is kind of a relational poem, when there's something about the kind of idea of a relational God that who is in his nature relational. He's kind of evoking it. And what do you think? I mean, I suppose the violence is there, but what do you think he's actually asking God to do?
It sounds like he's begging God and the Holy Spirit. He wants all three, because otherwise he can't. He might as well get divorced if he hasn't got all three of those things. Those people.
And it's that kind of violent new birth, isn't it? You're forced to break, blow, burn, and make me new. Like I want to be brand new and fresh and clean and delicate and alive. But the kind of put to death that whatever belongs to, is that violent language that the Bible uses of.
Sounds a bit like most marriages, do you think? What? I don't really know if normal married people will carry on. Is there a perfect marriage where they don't have goes at each other and want to batter each other or not? I don't really know about this. I just know that mine weren't too great. But I love it. Batter my heart. I really need you, God.
Yeah.
And he needs God to be powerful because of the how tightly he's bound or trapped, or like there's a force which holds him, and he is also held to it. Sort of, there's and he wants God to be stronger, and so he calls on him in that kind of
Yeah.
violent way to overcome
Yeah.
a force and a strength.
Yeah. So it seems like a person who is aware of the power of sin in, and possibly that's also the kind of the sin and the devil in this person, and therefore is asking God to give us a greater kind of strength. I suppose. Like I like an usurped town to another to labour to this, he's struggling to admit God, but oh to no end, reason your viceroy and me you should defend. So reason, which like your viceroy and me, so that the idea of God's appointed rule, that reason should act as God's defender within you, but it doesn't. It's weak. And then, is anybody? I mean, does anybody find it kind of troubling or like a bit odd?
I mean, yeah, I wouldn't pray like that.
Yeah, no.
Which, you know, I don't know if that's just because I'm a very repressed person, but
Yeah. I mean, because I had that reaction. I really like it in many ways. I think it's very powerful, but I struggle to, as you say, I wouldn't. That's not my feel. That's not my personal. That's not how I personally express. Not my theological.
Yeah, and if you combine the violent imagery with the sexual imagery,
Yeah,
that's quite troubling.
Yeah.
It's
But the fourth line makes me think a little bit. It's kind of a little bit like the potter who remakes the thing, although it sounds maybe a bit more like a blacksmith sort of smashing. But it has that kind of craftsman making something that's resistant into something, try and make it something new and beautiful. But having to use.
He sounds like he's got a split personality because he's saying, but I'm big. He's saying he's wanting to be with God, or he is with God, and then he's saying, but divorce me because I'm married to your enemy.
Yeah.
It sounds like he's a very bad sinner, and he wants God to beat him up, like because
I think I read it slightly.
punish him.
I think I read it, but he maybe you're right, and I've not quite got it. But I think I read it as he needs God to break that relationship to his sin.
Yeah.
Like he's kind of betrothed to his sin.
Yeah, and he can't get
and,
away.
And he can't get away,
like
but
an addiction or something.
yeah, that's right. And he
An
needs God to almost violently intervene
Yeah.
so that it breaks that relationship.
But then he's asking God to divorce him. In 1 minute he's saying, in some words, he needs him, and then he's saying, divorce me.
Well, I think he's like, maybe he's saying, divorce me from my sin. And so he needs to kind of, but that is does become problematic, because then it's like, okay, what is the relationship with God then doing? It's kind of it.
I guess it's break that knot again. It's like a habitual, you know, we return to the vomit of our sin. We return like again and again. Would you forgive? Would you break the power of take away the love of sin? Is that kind of
But he sounds very honest.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because I think a lot of like Dunn's early poems, I'm not sure whether they really are very frank, in the sense they're kind of like a persona that he's adopting. And they're often frank kind of erotic, but they're not necessarily, it's not necessarily, you don't necessarily get the sense of his voice. Whereas I think this, it does seem so unmediated, and the weirdness of it, I think, makes it more clear that it's an unmediated sort of way. And I think it is strange and troubling, but at the same time gets at something in our relationship.
to look at Zoe's point, like I would similarly be like I can't imagine that being uttered, but why does he write it? Like, is his purpose to teach us how to see our sin? Is it to kind of demonstrate a picture of my sin that I think I'm just tolerating and not being in control of some days? Or is his language so violent and so in kind of betrayal, like adulterous language? It's kind of Hosea language, but you know, like, is this designed to help us see what I don't see, or pray what I should pray? What's this like?
Question. I don't know. I'm not sure I know much about its sort of reception history, and whether he intended it to be read sort of publicly or not, or whether it's sort of more of a private kind of meditation. I mean, and I suppose that's a very good question. Do you think it kind of extends or might deepen the way we think about our relationship with God, perhaps, and our sin? This is kind of maybe, does it enable us to think about God in a fresh way at all? In a new way?
Yeah, resting, isn't it? Like you were saying, Carol, it kind of makes you think, what is his, like, that sounds violent, it always sounds, you know, and so you were immediately wondering is this how he really relates to God, or is this his idea of marriage, or all of those things? But it's very arresting.
It sounds to me like a drug addict or an alcoholic.
It's quite a complicated character.
Well,
Yes,
Had quite a difficult life.
I'm not a done expert, it's not my kind of area. But yeah, he did.
Did he also write For Whom the Bell Tolls?
Yeah, that comes from it. Well, that line comes from one of his poems.
I think it's quite perfect. I know everyone's like, I don't know, I think it's just an incredible encapsulation of what God does to our hearts, and what, like, how God, you know, needs to just dig his thumbs in and mold us, and actually how that relationship is overwhelming. You know, we speak of the Ephesians marriage, it's like that running to God and ravishing, like completely changing it. You know?
No, I think, well, as like, as I was saying, I think sometimes I think is my reaction to it because I'm quite impressed. I'm kind of, and I'm not comfortable with these very emotional expressions. I just think it's kind of unusual. I think maybe and I think it's interesting to think about how maybe a different age had a very different way of expressing spirituality, and that's kind of what's. And it's also, I mean, I should say, thinking about the language, it's also the sound of it makes a little difference, doesn't it? Batter my heart, break, blow, that sort of alliteration. It really sounds like the blows that he's asking God to sort of perform on his heart, to kind of break him down. And I guess, you know, it is part of our understanding of the gospel is the way that God breaks power of sin and dying to self and so on, as we're talking about. But I guess I've never seen it expressed, or I've rarely seen it expressed in such a sort of I don't know, sort of immediate and kind of frank, or rarely seen it expressed in such an immediate and kind of personal and physical way, I'd say. I think that's the other part of it. It feels quite physical in many ways.
Also, is that partly because, I mean, like the dying to self or whatever, like that, like used so much, you don't think about it, but like Jodie says, that's actually violent imagery as well.
Yeah.
And we just don't notice it because it's what we say all the time.
Yeah.
And if this was, you know, part of the liturgy that was used every Sunday, it would be a really weird church. But like, you know, over the generations, it could become language that people don't really think about.
Do you feel sometimes things like that featuring worship songs like Jesus is my boyfriend?
There are a few where I'm like,
although those don't.
Not quite as violent.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's the violence combined with the erotic imagery.
I think it's like the giving off of yourself, that like it really is, you know, if you let someone ravish you, you are like relinquishing complete control. And actually that is that death to self that is kind of mirrored in that sexual imagery.
I mean, I mentioned George Herbert at the beginning. Herbert's very different. I think like Donne is very visceral or something, and Herbert's much more like, say, slightly more distant and more intellectual, I think, in the way that his relationship to God to what that means kind of poems. So that might have been an interesting comparison, but I wanted to start with something that maybe is kind of a talking point and takes us back into the sort of past. And then for the rest of the time, I really want to focus on
Can I say something?
yeah, go for it, yeah.
I just wanted to add in the Sufi tradition, God is seen as the beloved, So the love poem, it's traditional, very much like God is a part of us. It's like falling in love with ourselves. And in a way, he's angry with himself and he's angry with God. And there's this kind of complete passionate affair with a part of himself, and which God is the prolongation. But the other thing I wanted to share is like, in terms of being a foreigner, when I heard the poem, I understand nothing. And I've been living 25 years in England and my English is pretty good. But I think, and I really struggle with English poetry. So I had to look, and so in a way, I went into the poem from my mind. And I'm wondering when we, in terms of using words to talk about God, when it's really our mother tongue, it taps into really deep aspects of ourselves. Like I started learning English when I was 14, and so even though my English is pretty good, actually it doesn't tap into the parts of my psyche that it would for you. And I think that's quite interesting in terms of how poetry lands in the body. I just got to say that.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
David, have you got information on the background of John Donne?
I don't.
I don't know nothing about him. Except for his poetry.
He died of the plague.
Yeah, I've read about
No, before he died.
all in the late 16th century. Died about 1630, I think.
I'm wondering if he'd been in prison because he's talking about all of these.
Actually, one of the interesting things is he was from a Catholic family, but then kind of converts to Anglicanism at some point. And again, I don't know much about Donne. A lot around Donne is quite enigmatic, so I'm not really sure to what extent. And then he wrote some quite anti-Catholic polemics, I think. So kind of like not entirely sure whether any of that theology he held on to. Then he circulated these erotic poems that kind of are circulated privately when he was younger. Again, are they about him, or are they just sort of like the persona that he's adopting? There's a lot of like the way that he wrote in the period wasn't necessarily, because I think we think about poetry now as being very much your expression of yourself, whereas I think at the time of Donne's writing, it's very much more like, well, I'm going to write in this mode. I'm going to write in the mode of a lover. I'm going to write in the mode of a theologian who's thinking about this problem. And so becomes Dean of St Paul's. So he becomes an Anglican clergyman. I think there's a suggestion that the king, for whatever reason, tells him to become an Anglican clergyman, or suggests it will be a suitable way for him to kind of avoid making trouble or something. And becomes Dean of St Paul's, and you can read his sermons. Sermons. He's got a lot of sermons. And then these holy sonnets are published after his death. So I'm not sure exactly how they fit into. Other people may know more about them, but I'm not sure how they fit into the kind of whole trajectory of his life. But he certainly, and his family, because they were Catholic under Elizabeth I, did suffer kind of persecution because of that. So that's part of his background. Whether that kind of again informs his sort of understanding as things develop, I don't know. And again, there's sort of writing between the different modes, like writing very well known in these circles for writing love poetry, and then writing holy poetry, as it were. Like again, and almost using some of the same registers is kind of again really interesting. But I don't kind of have sort of kind of hard biographical data because he's the same sort of, he's a kind of contemporary of Shakespeare. In some ways, those kind of guys, he has some brief sketches of them. I don't know very much about them.
I think he did nearly die of the plague and then he recovered. I think so. There's something of a Philip Yancey look about him, and I think that's when he wrote the poem "Pushing Compass for Whom the Bell Tolls."
Right.
And I think what I remember, he was very ill and possibly it was a plague, and then he got better, and that made me feel like God had healed him or restored him, and then he needed to sort of devote his life to God. I think there was something about that. And he was maybe writing that other poem while contemplating the concept of his death, Come For Me Now. I can't remember what Philip gets. It was a book with Philip Yancey, who's a Christian writer. It sort of wrote about influences of his faith or people who had inspired him or interested him. And there's a whole chapter about John Donne in there.
Yeah,
And if I can only remember the name of the book, but it's quite a good book. Just
We could Google it.
yeah, yeah.
It's one of, so that if you want more of an in-depth a dive into John Donne,
Later.
it's in there.
That's really helpful. So yeah, I mean, I'm not a diet, but it's kind of just a way of setting up, we're introducing something to start with, and then we're going to think about some more. Everything else really is 20th century. And so the next poem I'm going to read to you is called AAA Domine Deus, or RRR Domine Deus, by a poet called David Jones. So Jones was, and I put it over 2 slides to prepare. So Jones was, I guess, called a modernist poet. He was also an artist, and he worked in various different media, obviously poetry, but also kind of art, painting and etching. He converted to Catholicism in 1921. After this he fought in the First World War. This kind of extraordinary experience in the First World War, when he was kind of moving through a ruined village, bombed village in France, and he just caught a glimpse of a mass being celebrated in a chapel that had sort of bombed out, and yet this congregation was still there celebrating the mass, and that became a kind of transformative experience for him, and that kind of was central to his conversion. And he talks about poetry and writing and art more generally as being kind of sacramental. So what he's interested in is thinking about art, writing and visual arts as well, as being a sort of way of linking God to us through some sort of visible form, I guess. But yeah, what is interesting, I meant to show you, I ran out of time, but I meant to show you some of James's art, which are well worth having a look at. He produced a lot of sort of religious devotion art as well. But let me read this poem and let's have a think. This is going to be a little bit more, in some ways, obviously, it's more modern language, so it might be easier, but in other ways, it's more complex than we've done. So you might want to sort of mull over it as I talk. So, David Jones, RRR Domine Deus. I said, what shall I write? I inquired up and down. He's tricked me before with his manifold lurking places. I looked for his symbol at the door. I have looked for a long while at the textures and contours. I've run a hand over the trivial intersections. I have journeyed among the dead forms, causation projects from pillar to pylon. I have tried the eyes of the mind, regarding the colours and lights. I have felt for his wounds in nozzles and containers. I have wondered for the automatic devices. I have tested the inane pattern without prejudice. I've been on my guard not to condemn the unfamiliar, for it is easy to miss him at the turn of a civilization. I've watched the wheels go round in case I might see the living creatures, like the appearance of lamps, in case I might see the living God projected from the machine. I've said to the perfected steel, be my sister, and for the glassy towers I thought I felt some beginnings of his creature, but Domine Deus, my hands found the glade's work unrefined, and the terrible crystal is stage piece. Domine Deus. So Domine Deus means Lord God. What do we, just take a moment to sort of judge. Let's have a look at the first part of it. What do we think might be going on in this poem?
I don't understand it.
Is he looking to God for some kind of inspiration?
It's very complex, this one. Yeah, it's quite, I think looking for God is right.
Is he looking for God in something? I also don't understand it, but like it feels like he's contemplating an object or something that's a creation or something.
So, yeah.
The second I got more of the feeling of what he's, sort of like a world that's becoming more and more just a big machine,
Yeah,
and he's looking to God.
yeah, yeah. So if you think about the kind of opening lines, like, and that's definitely right. The second half, you get these images of, and even actually in the first bit, you get these images of modernity, don't you? Pillar to pylon, causation projects, and then you get machine.
I mean, this is literally a
Glass-
machine that,
glass
but
and
yeah,
glass, yeah.
wheels.
automatic devices.
And,
If you look at the first few lines, like I could, oh, what shall I write? And quiet up and down. He's tricked me before his manifold lurking in places. If we assume that he is God there, he's tricked me. But why might, what does the idea of lurking in places express? Okay. Why lurking in places? What does that suggest?
Isn't that places where you hide?
Yeah. Yeah, hiding places.
But it's a bit shifty. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Shifting, the word lurk is like, it suggests a shiftiness, doesn't it? It suggests a sort of kind of something not entirely positive, I guess.
It's hanging around.
Yeah, exactly. Lurking around.
But interesting, it's manifold looking places. So there are lots of these places where
Yeah,
he's lurking and hidden and
Yeah.
hiding.
yes.
But the sense that God is very close. and
Yeah.
yet wants to, by lurking, he's kind of there, but not wanting to be seen. And so you have to kind of
Yeah,
almost catch God out in order to turn it.
that's interesting. Yeah, so I guess to go on from the idea of like, well, it's shifty or it's also possibly the idea that somebody's watching you, but they don't necessarily want you to find them. Lurking. Which is interesting. I mean, again, maybe we'll come back to that question, but again, it suggests something about the way this poet or the speaker, should always make a distinction between the poet and the speaker, but like the way the speaker is like relating to God. I don't know. Yeah, go on.
I was going to say, yeah, that he's sort of quite actively trying to find out. So, like, it felt Bruce Williams and lots of pain. It's like I sort of get the image to be sort of almost rummaging around the. Like he's not just going about his business and hoping to spot God. He's at least sort of putting out feelers and like let's just check under this box or whatever. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. It has that sense, doesn't it? Yeah. Also, what should I write? So it's a suggestion that it's also self-consciously about writing. Essentially, the potential of what writing about God or finding God as you write or in the way that you might write, I suppose.
What strikes me between both authors is that they both lay bare. You see what I mean? One is kind of a bit sensual, angry, a bit naughty, whatever, and the other one more begging or more curious. But actually, there is something in their eye that is they're there. So that's what I'm picking up.
So the kind of vulnerability, like,
Yeah.
such a, I need God in something. How do I sort of express that in the form of literature?
And in the very process of writing, actually making it open, whether they share the poem or not, in the way they make it open. Well, our relationship with God is usually very intimate. So when we write in a way we reveal something of that intimacy. I don't know.
I have felt that his wounds in Nozzles of Contains. I wonder what people have made of that couple of wounds.
Like that radio painting, where Jesus like
Yeah.
they've got their skins and they've got their fingers and his flesh, and it's that kind of what visually it makes me think of.
Yes.
Putting your fingers in a place that you don't really know what's in there, but just like, like that.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it kind of it makes it clear that it's not just God the abstract or even God the Father, but Christ, I think, or God as expressed in. And I think the crucifixion is particularly important to James. He did a lot of cross pictures, crucifixion pictures. And so finding God's also finding God in his suffering, in his wounds, I think. But I mean, it's an odd juxtaposition also, isn't it? Like in wounds in nozzles and containers. It's an odd one. I've watched the wheels go around in case I might see the living creatures like the appearance of lamps. So we'll make it that. Two minutes.
Almost sounds like Ezekiel sort of wheels within wheels.
Yeah. Because that is, I mean, I don't remember.
But I can't remember if there's lamps in that.
Very clearly, but it is wheels and living creatures.
Yeah.
So
Those the lights you get on the back of the bikes.
So you think Jones is just like watching cars at car wheels going by in case he gets a glimpse of the wheels of Ezekiel and the kind of and living creatures. I mean, it's so there's some kind of so there's looking for God. There's some kind of relationship with the world around us, and the modern world in particular. I think so. So he was talking about at the beginning. So that the machine, the glassy towers, and we've also seen other sort of references to sort of technology. What does he? I mean, what does he want out of this world? Do you think? So I've watched the wheels go around in case I might see the living creatures like the appearance of lamps, in case I might see the living God projected in the machine. I have said to the perfected steel, human sister, the glassy towers, I thought I felt some beginnings of his creature, but Argomedes, my hands found the glazed work, unrefined, the terrible crystal stage. It's tricksy, yeah.
Is he hoping to find God in all of that, or is he hoping to find something and it turns out to be not as good as God?
I don't know if this helps, but I see him like commenting on like progression. It's like the civilization progresses. We've got these incredible buildings and we construct things out of steel, and it's genuinely quite impressive. But it's sort of not. It's just kind of lazy, unrefined, terrible. You know, like not. He's not seeing and not finding God in either that wounded, suffering form, nor in a sort of terrifying, the living God form. That's fine. That's,
and I think, like, at the same time, you know, it is like the manifold lurking places. He doesn't want to miss out on some kind of visionary experience. And if you think about, again, the idea of sacramental, sort of sacramental experience, I mean, I think that kind of starts informing his, the way he thinks about this quite a lot. So, I suppose what's important in sacraments is a kind of physical manifestation of God's grace. Yes. And so he sort of looks almost like he's looking around the physical world, and particularly this modern technological world, hoping that there might be some sort of transcendent experience of God in it, but constantly missing it. But there's part of him that just still thinks he might meet God around the corner because of the manifold lurking places.
but in this poem, maybe I haven't interrupted you with this stuff. In this poem, like, he doesn't explore any. He's not like he's looking in all the places. He's just looking in tech. Like, you know, he's just looking at kind of shiny built things and holes and pillars and like, Tupperware or whatever. And Hoover nozzles stuff. Like, he's not looking in relationships. He's not looking in like places of desolation. He's not looking at, you know, there are, I don't know, other places that maybe he could have explored in this poem, but particularly he's just saying, not kind of, there's something cool here, but I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I'm finding God.
I think that's quite a good summation. And I don't know with the title whether the RRR is symbolic of anything other than sort of hesitancy, like I don't really know what to say. It's a sort of stutter almost. But you know, Dominic it's like I mean, it might be something really difficult to explain references, but it feels like that. But I can't really. I've stopped being able to sort of speak here. I've stopped being able to comprehend the world around me, and so I actually need something to. And I kind of need the intervention of those things that I can not able to find him in the skyscrapers or whatever the machine is, the ocean view or whatever. But it is that weird tech focus is very distinctive, I think, and makes it quite unusual poem, quite weird.
I wonder, because those are the words of Thomas, aren't they? And you said put your hands stop doubting and believe. He just said, my Lord, my God.
Yes.
And whether he's anticipated.
That's a good point. That may well be, that might be the reference.
Because my hands found the glazed word.
It doesn't seem like a poem to me. It seems like a little story.
Yeah.
A little essay or something. It's not rhyming at all.
It's modernism. And that's the thing about James, is that he was a modernist, but he's writing experimentally. In the forms that often use free verse and cut things up. And if you sort of read any, like, you might come across T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound, there's kind of poets of that era, they're all writing a very similar mode, which is kind of cut up and sort of experimental forms and doesn't rhyme. But what's interesting about him is he's very modern. He's also kind of deeply invested in well, in his art, almost a sort of medieval way of depicting. If you look at his art, it's very almost like Byzantine, like a Byzantine icon, or some medieval style etching. So there's a kind of interesting dichotomy of this kind of ancient ways of looking at Christian theology and this kind of modern form of poetry that he's trying to use.
Do you have any, sorry, David, do you have any like pictures of what his on his writing? Do you have anything?
I probably could like find. I don't know how easy it is to access the internet.
Because he's talking. That's like art. He's trying to describe something in his. It sounds like a picture art.
Well, maybe
like painting.
What we could do is when I get to the end, I could try and sort of access the internet and I can find some David Jones pictures because they're quite interesting to think about and might help you think about what he's doing with the poetry.
Yeah.
Going to move on to quite a different. We're actually the last two examples going to be fiction, so we're going to move on to quite a different type of literary form here, and we're going to think about two examples of fiction, really. And I wanted to include this story because it's called Graves, mainly because it's called Graves, but also because Joyce is playing, I think, in this story, the idea of grace. So, to give you a bit of background on Joyce, James Joyce, Irish writer, born about 1880, something like that, dies about 1940. And in about 1914, he publishes this series of stories called Dubliners, out of which this story comes. Dubliners is a collection, Joyce was from Dublin. Dubliners is a collection which explores all sorts of like ordinary people in Dublin and their everyday lives, their everyday encounters. And all of these stories have sort of, a lot of them have a kind of epiphanic moment, so a moment where something changes or something shifts. And this story, Grace, I'll tell you kind of about the sort of basic, because it won't really make sense to tell you about the basic kind of structure, what happens in it. At the beginning of Grace, we meet this character, Kenyon, who's kind of, he's drunk and he's kind of fallen down onto the floor, in Joyce's words, in the lavatory, so he's kind of collapsed. And he clearly has a problem with alcohol. And through the story, his friends kind of intervene and help him to kind of put his life back on track. His friend called Mr. Power, which I think is a sort of significant name, helps him to kind of put his life back on track. And in the end, he sort of ends up going to this kind of Jesuit retreat and listening to this sermon, which we can see at the end of the story. Joyce's brother, Stanislaus Joyce, suggested that the story was a kind of parody of Dante's Divine Comedy. So if you know or have heard of Dante's Divine Comedy, it's a 3-part poem, and each part is devoted to a different sort of state of the afterlife. So hell is the first part, purgatory the second part, paradise the third part. And the idea was that Grace was a sort of parody of this structure. So he starts in hell, he's unconscious in the lavatory, then he goes through this sort of purgatorial experience of being lifted out to this kind of new life, and then he ends in paradise, which is this Jesuit retreat, listening to this character at the end. So that's the structure. But what I think, but because it's a parody, you have to, and Joyce wasn't, although Joyce came from a Catholic background, was kind of fascinated by theology, fascinated by Christian theology. Joyce wasn't a Christian and was kind of often questioning or undermining, especially the idea of, particularly the idea of the organised church. So you've got to think about like what Joyce is doing in terms of the sort of the use of the word grace is kind of probably. So all that is kind of background to set this story up. But this is the very end of the story in 2 slides. I'm going to read it and then we'll take it in and think about what might be going on. So remember, got the main character and his friends, they're all sitting in this Jesuit retreat, this Jesuit chapel, and they're listening to the priest who's coming in to kind of preach the sermon. And the text, actually the text, if it's interesting to you, the text the priest is talking about is the parable of the shrewd manager from Luke 16. So that's the text that kind of Father Purdon develops. So Father Purdon developed the text with resonant assurance. It was one of the most difficult texts in all the scriptures, he said, to interpret properly. It was a text that might seem to the casual observer at variance with the lofty morality preached by Jesus Christ. But, he told his hearers, the text had seemed to him specially adapted for the guidance of those whose lot it was to lead the life of the world, and who yet wished to lead that life not in the manner of world. It was a text for businessmen and professionals. He told his hearers that he was there that evening for no terrifying, no extravagant purpose, but as a man of the world speaking to his fellow men. He came to speak to businessmen, and he would speak to them in a business-like way. If you might use a metaphor, he said, he was their spiritual accountant, and he wished each and every one of his hearers to open his books, the books of his spiritual life, and see if they tallied accurately with conscience. Jesus Christ was not a hard taskmaster. He understood our little failings, understood the weakness of our poor fallen nature, understood the temptations of this life. We all have from time to time our temptations. We all had our failings. But one thing only, he said, he would ask of his hearers, and that was, be straight and manly with God. Their accounts tallied in every point. He said, well, I verified my accounts, I find all well. But if, as might happen, there were some discrepancies, to admit the truth, to be frank and say like a man, well, I looked into my accounts, I find this wrong and this wrong. But with God's grace, I will rectify this and this. I will set right my accounts. So this is the very ending of the story. This is what Joyce leaves us with, this idea of grace. And I just wonder, like any sort of, I mean, it's a hard question to ask. You haven't read the story, but any sort of impressions of kind of what's going on at the end of this story, and what Joyce's attitude to you, particularly, I guess, to this priest and what he's saying here might be.
Seems to make me fun of it a little bit.
Yeah.
Like a little wry smile. It's fun for me. I sneeze, poking fun.
I mean, I suppose that sort of poking fun, that parody. I mean, I suppose to take the idea of grace, do you think? Again, this may be a difficult question, fair question, but do you think that the idea of grace being sketched out by this preacher here is kind of satisfactory, or is as complete as you might, as it could be, you think?
No, because it sounds like you're sorting out your own accounts and you're setting things right. And if God could just hold on a little bit and be a little bit patient with me and have a bit of grace, I'll get it all fixed. If you just stand off just for a moment,
it doesn't quibble about like the small
God's
details.
grace is more a kind of, is not God coming in and picking you up when you're dead, but it's more like, God just giving you an extra 5 minutes to sort of notice a few things that aren't quite right.
I feel it doesn't quite capture the whole, I guess, the relationship with God, that it's not about working to be good enough. It's that you can be failing, I think largely, but if you take it to God, His ways will encompass you. You don't have to be, I'll just sort it out for myself. I think, and I wonder sometimes if it's a bit of a misunderstanding that people who are not Christian or haven't, or even some people who are Christian. No, I think it's all about, I'll just sort it out myself and then God will approve. But actually, it's all about God redeeming you regardless of if you recognise Him and open your arms to Him, regardless of what efforts you do to try and redeem yourself, even though that's valuable, but that's not the point.
I think so. Yeah, I think one of the things Joyce is about, I think he thought that religion in Dublin had become very sort of commercial, or had been sort of attached to a private middle class sort of capitalist mentality, and I guess that all those metaphors are about money. And I guess in some ways it's the shrewd parable of the shrewd manager. That makes sense. Like in some ways, maybe we shouldn't be too unfair on this preacher. But I mean, but I think there's something kind of quite constrained, almost sort of mean about, or not means wrong, but kind of quite disappointing about the remit of this idea of grace here. It's almost as if the grace is just so that this character, whoever he's talking to, can rectify their accounts. And it just seems like kind of quite inadequate for like what a sort of understanding of what God's grace is really means.
I like the way that he's kind of playing with the idea of how to understand that parable. That's a notoriously kind of hard parable in terms of interpretation, but it's quite interesting that he's thinking about that in terms of grace, but it does end up feeling quite transactional. With God's grace is this thing that I need, it's like a kind of debit and credit and a balance sheet. And if I can, if I'm this much in debt and I've got this much grace to kind of pay it off, then that's me done.
Then that's okay. Yeah,
David, just want to say, you can really see though how if your experience of religion and Christianity is quite sort of just cultural, and maybe a bit, you see the hypocrisy of that way of living, where people just sort of, I feel like they're mostly okay, but they're definitely okay because they go to church, and so that sort of writes off, they're do-gooding, sort of writing off, the issues in their life, rather than really being like maybe James Joyce's experience isn't of those who've thrown themselves on God's grace and been humble and desperate. And so then you come up and you do look at that kind of religion and think, oh look, like there you are, just kind of
Absolutely, and the idea that you could actually say, well, I've verified my Catholic find all well.
Yeah.
That's an option. I mean, it feels a lot like an idea of grace that people come up with, like just generally, like, and I guess you get the feeling that the priest is sort of, he's found a way to connect with his audience.
Yeah.
And like, that's, you know, what he's done, and, you know, whether he's ever, you know, actually understood God's grace. You know, maybe not, but he's lost it by,
And it, you know, to be straight and manly.
yeah, it's very like, you know, weird, it's the, you know, I'm speaking, you know, you're businessmen and professionals, and I speak to you as a fellow man, like it's that very sort of, I need to be in with you.
Yeah.
And so my conception of grace has just disappeared
It's as
to
if
line up with what how you see the
Yeah.
world.
it's as if it's become like adapted to this idea of like a kind of masculine sort of like so masculine kind of economic morality so based around
I guess it's not very macho to receive grace, actually, like actual grace rather than just getting payments to your accounts.
It's interesting, I suppose, like, I mean, I know the backstory sort of, I don't know whether the backstory complicates that in the sense that that the guy who's at the centre of the story is sort of restored by his friends. But I guess and if it's a sort of parody of Dante, so we're ending up in paradise, it's that kind of like quite disappointing paradise, really, in the sense the sermon doesn't really, it's not, so it's sort of, there is a restoration of some kind there, because he starts the story in the toilet, that's actually Joyce's actual words, and then ends up, but then it's a sort of like a accession to a sort of like respectable morality, isn't it? Kind of rather than the sort of power of kind of God's intervention.
And that, and that sense of how much the I is repeated, I verify it, I find it as well. But you know, if I put into it, I find it's wrong, I put in a little bit of God's grace, I'll rectify it, I'll set right my accounts. The kind of ludicrousy of our own self-evaluation, like that we assume that we can trust our judgments of ourselves, whether for good or for bad, and assume that it really is up to us to sort it out. That's even a possibility. Is like
Do you think Joyce realizes that he's written a really disappointing paradise?
Oh yeah, it's totally,
I mean,
it's totally brilliant. It's totally like, this is kind of the best that Dublin provide. I mean, he's very bitter. In some ways, he's also very, he left Dublin, and he's writing about a city that he kind of has a love-hate relationship with. Kind of bitter. He thinks it's kind of very, has very low horizons. He doesn't think Dublin has a very, he's kind of contemptuous of Dublin in some ways, even though in Dublin he's also exploring the life of Dublin and has a lot of compassion for the people who live in the city. He's also kind of quite negative about the social structure of Dublin, and that's kind of comes through there because it's basically a kind of bourgeois morality he's kind of attacking, and this sort of very limited idea of grace compared to what Dante was doing in Paradiso, which is that what his sort of model. But I mean, it's also, the other interesting thing is that he uses the word grace in the story in lots of different ways. So characters are described as standing with grace, or kind of he held himself with grace. And the word grace is repeated lots and lots of times in the story to mean slightly different things. So I think again it's interesting, because actually in English obviously it does mean, it means theological grace, but it also means something of grace and dignity and those things. So which is interesting. So one of the things that Stanislaus Joyce, his brother, said was that Joyce had given up on religion but remained fascinated with the idea of grace. And I think in I think in Catholic theology there's more of a distinction between the idea of actual grace and sanctifying grace. So this idea of the grace that you need to do stuff, and the sanctifying grace that comes from Christ and is moved through the sacraments and puts you in a state of grace. So I think Joyce was fascinated in that distinction and what that would mean. So I think he's definitely interested in grace, but kind of this is not clearly not it. Okay, so last example, and And again, we've got two, a cut pattern to two there. This is from Barry O'Connor's story, Revelation. It's maybe read any Barry O'Connor. So kind of interesting writer. Again, Roman Catholic background. Grew up and lived most of life in Georgia in the deep south of the United States. Most of her stories are set in the South and have this very distinctive kind of Southern American feel, I guess. She's often called, like, described as Southern Gothic, because there's a sort of often a sort of grotesquerie, a kind of extremity about her writing that puts her along with other writers like Faulkner, I put in that sort of bracket. So there's a kind of extreme, a lot of her stories have a kind of extreme feel. This is an interesting story, and it gives us a sense of like the way in which different characters encounter grace. So this story focuses on a character called Mrs. Turpin. Mrs. Turpin is highly respected and highly thinks very highly of herself, and sees herself as a kind of very religious and moral and God-fearing person, and kind of looks down upon. There's a kind of racist sort of element to her. She looks down on people who are black and live around her in the South of the United States. She looks down on people who are poor, as you can see in this passage. And in this story, Mrs. Turpin encounters, she's waiting in a doctor's waiting room, and she encounters this girl who clearly suffering from some kind of mental illness, who basically attacks her verbally and calls her a warthog from hell, something like that. And at the end of the story, Mrs. Turpin kind of is trying to grapple with this and sees this as maybe some kind of intervention of God, that this voice from this girl, this kind of condemnatory voice, what does this mean? I'm not like this, I'm not terrible, I'm not terrible, this terrible person. And then at the end of the story, she has this kind of vision. This is what is going on in these two passages. So I'll read them and then we'll sort of dig into them a bit before we close. Until the sun slipped finally behind the tree line, Mrs. Turpin remained there with her gaze penciling as if she were absorbing some abysmal, life-giving knowledge. At last she lifted her head. There was only a purple streak in the sky, cutting through a field of crimson and leading like an extension of the highway into the descending dusk. She raised her hands from the side of the pen in a gesture hieratic and profound. A visionary light settled in her eyes. She saw the street as a vast swinging bridge extending upward from the earth to a field of living fire. On it, a vast horde of souls were rumbling toward heaven. There were whole companies of white trash, battalions of freaks and lunatics shouting and clapping and leaping like crows. And bringing up the end of the procession was a tribe of people whom she recognized at once as those who, like herself and Claude, that's her husband, had always had a little of everything, and the God-given wits to use it right. She leaned forward to observe them closer. They were marching behind the others with great dignity, accountable as they would always be for good order and common sense and respectable behaviour. They alone were on key, yet she could see by their shocked and altered faces that even their virtues were being burned away. She lowered her hands and gripped the rail of the hog pen, her eyes small but fixed unblinkingly on what lay ahead. In a moment, the vision faded, but she remained where she was, immobile. At length, she got down and made her slow way on the darkened path. In the woods around her, the invisible cricket choruses had struck up. What she heard were the voices of the souls climbing upward to the starry field and shouting hallelujah. So kind of what do you say about this sort of vision that Mrs. Turpin has here, this sort of vision of heaven, anything that sort of strikes us or what we talk about?
Is there a sense that the first shall be last? So she thinks that she's at the head of the group really, but in fact, she's going to be right at the back, and hoping that by the grace of God, she will actually live his space when she gets there. Hence the kind of shock of those people.
And again, in a way, some kind of conversation with the previous text, in the sense that there's something about respectability and kind of whether that kind of gets broken, simply gets broken down when you sort of encounter God's grace, if it's actual power, I suppose. I mean, I'm particularly interested in that past paragraph there in the second passage. They alone wrong, yet she could see by their shocked and altered faces that even their virtues were being burned. That as a kind of vision of God's grace, I suppose, so that even their virtues were being burned away.
Doesn't Paul give a list of why he's first among them, and then the council otherwise?
It's Philippians 3, and actually a couple of weeks ago Pete was preaching on Philippians 3. We had this great line. He said it's not just that we need to repent of our sin, but we need to repent of our righteousness too. And it's quite striking just how that's brought into life here. That these people who, just go back and the previous paragraph, had considered themselves righteous or virtuous for all sorts of things in all sorts of ways, actually those things are being stripped away from them.
It's the council, they've always been good order and common sense and respectful behaviour, and these may be the virtues that have been burned. They're shocked and also faces that even their virtues are being burned away. So that the people at the back who bring up the rear, these are the respectable people, and yet they are clearly they are in the kingdom. It's clear it's not that they're being excluded from this vision, but it's just this idea of who is most valuable. And I guess also, and interestingly, Flannery O'Connor signed some of her letters Mrs. Turpin. So she saw herself in this character, this judgmental character. She saw herself as a bit of a snob. She saw herself as sometimes a bit racist. And she kind of was aware that this sort of judgmentalism was something that she needed to repent of, I think. And so I think in this character, she's also kind of exploring some of the darker aspects of her own psyche. And I think this is the segregated South, and the sense of kind of, it's a hierarchy in which, which if you're black, you have no rights, and you're at the bottom of this pile, and then people she calls described as white trash, and above that, and then she's kind of above that as well, but then that order's entirely reversed.
It reminds, like, it's just brought to mind that I like the Isaiah verse, like our righteous deeds being as filthy rags. Right on the everything.
I guess it's a sort of a concept of someone who's missed the point, and then they realise it when they get to heaven, and they're like,
Except there's grace for them as well.
Yes. At the same time, they're also, because which is a more contemporary novel that I've read, which there's a whole thing about a minister kind of going to heaven and being deemed not fit and being sent to hell instead, and running back and being, I'll hang around in purgatory. Thank you very much. But that whole thing of people who think they've lived a really good life, but then they're turned away altogether, at least they're being they're still invited, but I guess it's that whole thing of opportunities that you missed to actually live this really full, connected life with God, and you were so focused on being virtuous.
And it's a total reversal of so, the mores and norms of our society. What about the last paragraph? Roots around her invisible cricket choruses struck up what she heard in the voices of the souls. And again, I think this idea of I suppose, transcendental realities, or the way in which a reality can be behind what you see. It's an interesting, I mean, in some ways, having a vision is quite an unusual way of ending. It's quite sort of, it's not very realist in some way, having this sort of vision. And it sort of upends, like the whole story is kind of about her sort of looking around these people and judging them kind of for being, not respectable, essentially. And then, in a sense, what happens at the end is a revelation. You need to have God's intervention to take us back to the dawn. In some ways, you need God to kind of intervene to sort of upend things and show you that things are the other way than what you think. But I think what's interesting is the sort of other way the physical world around her is still there, but the invisible cricket choruses, the night sounds, also become this vision of this kind of transformed kingdom.
Well, the shouting hallelujahs is kind of not common sense and good order.
No,
it's like the woman who comes and anoints Jesus' feet with the perfume.
Yeah,
everyone's a bit shocked, and Jesus talks about if you've been forgiven a lot, then
and that's sort of that contrast between drawing that contrast between those that in good order and the shouting and clapping and leaping. So they're like actually totally free physical expression, and it's like very sort of like restrained and proper and prim kind of group of people bringing up the rear. Does anybody else want to say anything before we close? I think we have to close. But, any questions? Going to kind of look for a sort of David Jones painting or something, so let's see if I can find it. So that that sort of thing. That's gives you an idea. Sort of working in almost a kind of like early Renaissance or medieval way of painting, but kind of very much that's interesting. But yeah, very much returning to the image of the crucifixion.
Have you been satisfied that when you've written, I don't know how you describe religious poetry, that you captured something true?
Not really. I mean, I guess like also I don't know. I think I've always wondered. I suppose one question I've had often in writing is whether a Christian is under an obligation to write.